The atmosphere in the House Financial Services Committee hearing room was already charged when billionaire hedge fund manager Scott Bessent leaned toward his microphone, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. His tailored charcoal suit and crisp blue tie projected the confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms rather than congressional hearings. "With all due respect, Representative Crockett," he said, his voice carrying the polished tone of Ivy League education, "your proposed Wall Street accountability regulations reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of capital markets." The C-SPAN cameras panned to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, whose expression remained neutral as Bessent continued his critique. Her burgundy blazer stood out against the chamber's wood paneling as she listened intently. "These misguided restrictions," Bessent continued with growing condescension, "would not only hamper market efficiency, but would erase decades of financial innovation that has created unprecedented prosperity." Then, with a dismissive chuckle that echoed through the chamber, he added, "But I suppose that's the legacy you're aiming for, being remembered as the Congresswoman who chose political theater over economic reality." A murmur swept through the gallery. Republican committee members exchanged knowing glances while Democrats shifted uncomfortably. The committee chairman leaned forward, clearly anticipating fireworks. As Bessent shuffled his papers with an air of finality, Crockett calmly adjusted her microphone. What happened in the next 30 seconds didn't just respond to his condescension. It systematically dismantled his entire argument and left the billionaire financier visibly stunned. No one expected the precision with which Crockett would expose not just the flaws in Bessent's testimony, but evidence suggesting his hedge fund had potentially engaged in the very practices her legislation aimed to regulate. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more political confrontations that the mainstream media won't show you. The exchange you're about to witness reveals what happens when Wall Street arrogance meets congressional preparation. Scott Bessent entered the congressional hearing with sterling credentials in the financial world. As founder and CEO of Key Square Capital Management, he had built a $5 billion hedge fund after previously managing investments for the legendary Soros Fund Management. His reputation as a macroeconomic strategist had made him a frequent commentator on financial news networks and a welcomed advisor in Washington's conservative circles. "For those who may not be familiar with my background," Bessent began in his opening statement, "I've spent 3 decades in global financial markets, managing investments through multiple economic cycles. My firm currently employs over 200 financial professionals and manages retirement assets for numerous institutional investors, including public employee pension funds." The hearing, titled "Market Accountability and Investor Protection: Examining Proposed Financial Regulations," had drawn unusual attention from both Wall Street and consumer advocacy groups. With concerns about market manipulation and investment inequality at multi-decade highs, the committee was evaluating competing approaches to financial oversight reform. Bessent had been invited by Republican committee members to provide expert testimony on the potential market impacts of new regulations. His prepared statement emphasized the importance of market flexibility and warned against excessive regulatory burdens that might drive investment capital overseas. "Free markets function best with appropriate guardrails," he testified, "but stifling innovation with unnecessary regulations ultimately harms the very investors these proposals claim to protect." Seated across from him was Representative Jasmine Crockett, whose rapid rise in the House Financial Services Committee had garnered attention from both financial reformers and industry insiders. The former civil rights attorney from Texas had recently introduced the Financial Accountability and Systemic Stability Act, legislation proposing new transparency requirements for large hedge funds, restrictions on certain high-frequency trading practices, and enhanced penalties for market manipulation. "Our financial markets should serve all Americans, not just the privileged few," Crockett had stated in her opening remarks. "This legislation maintains market dynamism while addressing documented abuses that have cost retail investors and pension funds billions of dollars." The contrast between them embodied America's ongoing debate about financial regulation. Bessent representing the established investment community's resistance to new oversight, and Crockett advocating for stronger protections against practices she characterized as sophisticated forms of market manipulation. The committee room overflowed with financial industry representatives, consumer advocates, economic policy experts, and journalists. Banking lobbyists clustered behind Republican members while reform advocates filled spaces behind Democrats. The partisan divide was visible not just in seating arrangements, but in the stark difference between questions from committee members on opposite sides of the aisle. Throughout the morning, technical experts had presented conflicting assessments of how the proposed regulations might affect market liquidity, trading costs, and investment returns. Republican members emphasized concerns about regulatory compliance costs, while Democrats focused on documented instances of market abuses and their impact on retail investors. When Bessent was recognized for his 15-minute expert testimony, he initially maintained a data-focused approach, presenting historical market performance statistics and international regulatory comparisons. However, as he concluded, his tone shifted from analytical to increasingly dismissive. "Mr. Bessent, you have 2 minutes remaining," the chairman noted. Bessent nodded, arranging several charts before him. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before concluding, I feel compelled to address some particularly troubling aspects of Representative Crockett's proposed legislation." He fixed Crockett with a critical gaze. While the Congresswoman presents her bill as investor protection, its actual provisions would severely restrict legitimate investment strategies that have democratized market access and improved returns for millions of Americans. As Bessent continued his critique, a committee staff member quietly passed Crockett a folder. She briefly reviewed its contents, her expression remaining professionally neutral despite whatever information she had just received. "With the committee's indulgence," Bessent continued, "I believe examining the actual impact of similar regulations internationally demonstrates why this approach is fundamentally flawed." The chairman nodded approvingly. "Please proceed, Mr. Bessent." "What's your take on Wall Street executives testifying in Congress? Do they provide valuable expertise, or are they just protecting their own interests? Share your thoughts in the comments below." Representative Crockett's financial regulation proposal contains 3 fundamental flaws that warrant serious reconsideration, Bessent declared, rising slightly from his seat to emphasize his authority on the subject. The hearing room grew quiet as Bessent gestured toward the display screen, which showed a slide titled Critical Analysis, Financial Accountability, and Systemic Stability Act. First, the Congresswoman's legislation imposes position reporting requirements far beyond international standards. He indicated a chart comparing regulatory frameworks. Even the European Union, hardly known for regulatory restraint, doesn't require such intrusive disclosures, recognizing they would reveal proprietary investment strategies developed through years of research and innovation. Republican committee members nodded approvingly while Democrats took notes. Crockett remained composed, occasionally jotting brief comments without revealing her thoughts. Second, Bessent continued, advancing to his next slide, the bill's restrictions on certain trading algorithms reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of modern market operations. He displayed a complex diagram of trading infrastructure. These systems provide essential liquidity that benefits all market participants, including the retail investors the Congresswoman claims to champion. Bessent's confidence grew visibly as he warmed to his critique. But most concerning is the philosophical assumption underlying this legislation. He adjusted his glasses with practiced precision. This bill presupposes that financial professionals are adversaries to be restrained rather than experts allocating capital to its most productive uses. Looking directly at Crockett, he added, it's an approach that prioritizes punitive measures over market efficiency, politics over economic reality. A murmur rippled through the audience as Bessent projected his final slide showing economic projections. Our analysis indicates this legislation would reduce market liquidity by approximately 18%, potentially increasing transaction costs for ordinary investors by over $300 billion annually. He turned toward Crockett with barely concealed condescension. Congresswoman, have you considered how these additional costs would affect the retirement accounts of the very constituents you claim to represent? Has your staff conducted any quantitative analysis of these market impacts? Throughout this escalating critique, Crockett maintained remarkable composure, occasionally making notes while betraying no emotional reaction, a restraint that seemed to further embolden Bessent. "Mr. Chairman," she finally said, "I'd appreciate the opportunity to respond to these characterizations once Mr. Bessent concludes." "You'll have your time, Representative," the chairman replied dismissively. Encouraged, Bessent displayed a quote attributed to Crockett from a recent financial policy conference. "Wall Street's resistance to these regulations reveals their dependence on information asymmetry and market opacity to generate outsized returns." Looking up from the document with theatrical disappointment, Bessent sighed. Such statements reveal a concerning ideological bias rather than evidence-based policymaking. Financial markets aren't a morality play. They're complex systems requiring sophisticated understanding. With growing confidence, he projected what appeared to be economic impact studies. Independent analyses from prominent universities contradict the Congresswoman's claims about predatory practices. These studies demonstrate that the investment strategies her legislation would restrict actually improve market efficiency and price discovery. The revelation caused significant stir throughout the chamber. If accurate, the research would undermine key premises of Crockett's legislation. A senior Democratic committee member interjected sharply. "Mr. Chairman, the committee was not provided these studies in advance as required by our rules. Furthermore, I'd like to know which prominent universities produced this research and who funded it." The room erupted into disorder. Journalists typed frantically, committee members engaged in heated side conversations, and staffers rushed to consult with their principals. Throughout the commotion, Crockett remained composed, reviewing materials in the folder she had received earlier while occasionally observing Bessent's increasingly defensive posture. Raising his voice above the chaos, Bessent declared, "The American financial system deserves policy based on economic reality, not political talking points." These studies were published in peer-reviewed journals and represent consensus among market economists. As the chairman struggled to restore order, a young aide entered and handed a note to the ranking Democratic member. Reading it, her expression shifted from concern to visible satisfaction. "Mr. Chairman," she announced, "we've just received information that the studies Mr. Bessent referenced were not, in fact, independent academic research, but were commissioned and funded by the Alternative Investment Management Association, of which Mr. Bessent's firm is a prominent member. This funding relationship was not disclosed in the materials provided to the committee." This bombshell announcement sent shockwaves through the hearing room. Republicans objected vociferously while Democrats demanded immediate disclosure of all research funding sources. The chairman, now visibly uncomfortable, called a 15-minute recess. Cameras captured Bessent in urgent consultation with Republican staff members, his earlier confidence noticeably diminished. Across the room, Crockett methodically organized her materials, occasionally conferring with Democratic colleagues. Her calm demeanor suggested she had anticipated this very scenario. When the committee reconvened, Bessent attempted to regain momentum by introducing additional criticisms focused on international competitiveness and regulatory arbitrage concerns. Yet his delivery lacked the conviction of his earlier presentation. "In conclusion," Bessent stated, his tone notably moderated, "while investor protection is a worthy goal, Representative Crockett's approach represents regulatory overreach that would harm America's global financial leadership without achieving its stated consumer protection objectives." As Bessent concluded, all attention shifted to Congresswoman Crockett. The room fell silent as she prepared to respond. What followed would become one of the most referenced congressional exchanges on financial regulation in recent memory. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Crockett began, her voice carrying the measured precision of her legal background. The contrast between her composed delivery and Bessent's emotional presentation was immediately apparent to everyone in the chamber. "I appreciate Mr. Bessent taking time from his busy schedule managing billions of dollars to share his perspectives on market regulation," she continued, opening her portfolio with deliberate movements. "It's always valuable to hear directly from those whose activities would be subject to greater transparency requirements." A subtle ripple of reaction moved through the Democratic side of the committee dais. Rather than addressing each mischaracterization individually, I'll focus on the foundation of Mr. Bessent's entire argument. Once that's clarified, everything else falls into proper context. She nodded to a staff member, and the hearing room screens changed to display a financial disclosure form. This is an SEC Form 13F filing from Key Square Capital Management, Mr. Bessent's firm, from last quarter. I'd like to direct the committee's attention to the highlighted section. Adjusting her glasses, Crockett read the highlighted portion. Position established in Meridian Healthcare, 2.8 million shares, with average purchase price of $42.18 per share. She advanced to the next slide, showing a news headline. Meridian Healthcare stock plummets 68% following surprise FDA rejection. Mr. Chairman, 3 days after this FDA announcement, Mr. Bessent's firm filed an amended 13F showing they had actually reduced their Meridian position by 78% 2 weeks before the FDA announcement. This amended filing came only after a whistleblower raised questions about potential information asymmetry, the very issue my legislation addresses. The chamber erupted. Republican members shouted objections while Democrats called for order. Journalists rapidly typed on their devices as social media immediately began buzzing with reactions. When the room quieted, Crockett continued with unwavering composure. To be clear, I'm not alleging any specific wrongdoing by Mr. Bessent's firm. I'm simply highlighting why delayed position reporting and amended disclosures, practices my legislation would reform, create both the opportunity for abuse and the appearance of impropriety that undermines market confidence. She advanced to her next slide, showing side-by-side comparisons of market movement data. These patterns, identified by researchers at the Federal Reserve, show statistically significant price movements preceding major announcements affecting stocks where large hedge funds had recently altered positions. This data doesn't prove causation, but it certainly justifies enhanced transparency. Bessent's face visibly paled as he whispered urgently to nearby staff. Crockett maintained her methodical dismantling of his testimony. Regarding Mr. Bessent's claim about the independent studies contradicting my legislation's premises, I'd like to enter into the record these funding disclosures showing that all 3 studies were commissioned by industry associations where Mr. Bessent holds leadership positions. None of this funding was disclosed in the studies themselves, another transparency issue my legislation would address. With each point, Crockett systematically exposed the weaknesses in Bessent's presentation. Her legal background was evident in the precision with which she presented her counter-evidence. But perhaps most revealing, she said, her voice carrying controlled indignation as the screen displayed a calendar invitation and email, is this communication showing Mr. Bessent met with representatives from 5 major financial institutions just days before this hearing. The stated purpose was to coordinate messaging on the Crockett legislation and develop unified opposition strategy. A collective gasp filled the chamber. The issue had shifted from policy debate to questions about witness transparency and coordination. Mr. Chairman, Crockett said, addressing the committee leader directly, I move that the committee require all witnesses to disclose coordination with industry groups and financial ties to entities affected by legislation under consideration. Without such transparency, these hearings cannot fulfill their intended purpose of providing members with objective information. The chairman, visibly unsettled, struggled to maintain composure. The committee will take your request under advisement. Crockett wasn't finished. I'd also like to enter into the record this analysis from the Congressional Research Service examining the actual effects of similar regulations implemented in other jurisdictions, which contradicts Mr. Bessent's claims about reduced liquidity and increased costs. She lifted a bound report. Unlike the industry-funded studies Mr. Bessent cited, this independent analysis found that enhanced transparency requirements in Canada and Australia actually reduced volatility, narrowed bid-ask spreads, and increased retail investor participation, all while maintaining robust market function. Then, turning directly to Bessent, Crockett delivered the line that would dominate financial news for weeks. Mr. Bessent, you came here to lecture Congress about my legacy, but your testimony today perfectly demonstrates why this legislation is necessary. When financial elites can use obscured positions, delayed disclosures, and industry-funded research to maintain information advantages over ordinary investors, the market isn't free. It's just rigged in favor of those who can afford the most expensive algorithms and the best-connected analysts. The chamber fell completely silent. What began as a critique of Crockett's legislation had transformed into a powerful indictment of the very practices her bill aimed to reform. Breaking the silence, a moderate Republican committee member known for her financial expertise addressed the chairman. "Mr. Chairman, given these serious concerns about disclosure and research independence, I believe we should require additional transparency from all future witnesses regarding financial interests and coordination." This bipartisan acknowledgment underscored the impact of Crockett's counter-argument. Bessent finally spoke, his voice noticeably strained. "These characterizations are unfair. My firm follows all current disclosure requirements precisely as written." Crockett responded with calm confidence. "That's exactly my point, Mr. Bessent. Current requirements allow practices that create both the reality and appearance of an unlevel playing field. Your firm's technical compliance with existing rules while exploiting their limitations demonstrates precisely why those rules need strengthening." Turning back to the committee, she concluded with unwavering conviction. This legislation isn't about punishing success or restricting innovation. It's about ensuring that our markets function with the transparency and fairness necessary to maintain public confidence. When ordinary Americans believe the game is rigged, they stop participating, and that harms everyone, including legitimate financial institutions. Her voice grew more resolute. The Financial Accountability and Systemic Stability Act doesn't threaten properly functioning markets. It threatens only those practices that rely on opacity, information asymmetry, and delayed disclosure. The question before this committee isn't whether this will impact certain profitable strategies. It's whether those strategies serve or undermine the broader market's integrity. As Crockett concluded her response, the atmosphere in the hearing room had completely transformed. What began as her defense had evolved into a powerful case for financial reform, leaving Bessent and his allies visibly discomforted. The chairman, recognizing the shifted dynamics, quickly moved to the next witness. As attention turned elsewhere, cameras captured a telling contrast. Bessent hurriedly gathering his materials, his expression stunned, while Crockett calmly reviewed her notes, accepting quiet acknowledgments from colleagues on both sides of the aisle. In just 20 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had not only defended her legislation, but completely reversed the narrative, emerging as the unexpected victor in a confrontation that had backfired spectacularly on one of Wall Street's most prominent voices. By market close that day, Crockett versus Wall Street and Bessent backfire dominated financial news chyrons and social media. Video clips of Crockett's methodical dismantling of Bessent's testimony spread rapidly across investment forums and political websites, with commentators from across the ideological spectrum analyzing the exchange. Financial networks scrambled to assemble panels discussing the hearing's implications. Headlines told the story unequivocally. Crockett exposes hedge fund disclosure practices. Wall Street critic turns tables in congressional testimony. Financial reform gets unexpected boost after heated exchange. Outside the hearing room, reporters surrounded Congresswoman Crockett as she walked confidently through the Capitol corridor. "Congresswoman, did you anticipate Mr. Bessent's aggressive criticism of your legislation?" one journalist called out. Crockett paused briefly. "We'd heard numerous mischaracterizations of the bill's provisions from industry groups, so we came prepared with factual corrections. What was surprising wasn't the criticism, but the failure to disclose relevant financial interests when presenting supposedly objective analysis." Another reporter pressed, "Will you seek an ethics investigation into Mr. Bessent's testimony?" "This isn't about individual witnesses," Crockett replied firmly. "It's about improving our committee processes to ensure members receive transparent, properly disclosed information when evaluating legislation. My focus remains on advancing financial reforms that protect market integrity while maintaining America's competitive financial sector." Meanwhile, Scott Bessent was conspicuously absent from post-hearing media availability. Reports indicated he had left the Capitol immediately following the session. His firm issued a brief statement saying, Key Square Capital Management follows all current disclosure requirements and supports appropriate market transparency that doesn't compromise legitimate investment strategies or research. By evening, 3 significant developments had emerged. First, the Financial Accountability and Systemic Stability Act, previously considered unlikely to advance beyond committee, gained unexpected momentum. Several moderate representatives who had expressed skepticism requested briefings on the legislation's disclosure provisions, particularly those addressing amended filings and delayed reporting. "We need to evaluate this bill based on its actual text rather than industry characterizations," stated a centrist Democrat previously undecided on the measure. Today's hearing highlighted legitimate questions about transparency that deserve thoughtful consideration. Second, attention turned to the relationship between financial industry testimony and legislative outcomes. The materials Crockett presented suggested a broader pattern of coordinated opposition to financial regulations, prompting journalists to investigate connections between industry, funding, research production, and congressional testimony. This raises fundamental questions about how financial policy expertise is presented to Congress, noted a veteran financial regulation correspondent. When research is funded by affected industries without clear disclosure, it undermines the integrity of the entire legislative process. Third, Jasmine Crockett's national profile rose substantially. The second-term Congresswoman, already recognized for her effectiveness in hearings, was now being discussed as a significant voice in financial reform with potential for broader leadership. "What we witnessed today wasn't just political theater," observed a former SEC commissioner. "Crockett demonstrated rare ability to translate complex financial practices into clear policy implications. That combination is precisely what effective financial regulation requires." As Washington processed the day's events, the ripple effects continued expanding. Financial industry publications struggled to frame the narrative, with some questioning Crockett's characterizations while others acknowledged the legitimate transparency issues she had raised. "The disclosure concerns merit serious industry reflection," admitted one market analyst in Bloomberg Opinion. While reasonable people can disagree about regulatory approaches, the appearance of coordinated opposition without proper disclosure ultimately undermines industry credibility. Financial reform advocates celebrated Crockett's performance, calling it a template for effectively countering industry talking points. "This is exactly how legislators should respond to Wall Street opposition," declared a prominent consumer advocacy group. "Be thoroughly prepared with specific examples, understand the technical details, and focus on systemic impacts rather than getting drawn into ideological debates." By the following morning, the story had transcended financial circles to reach mainstream America. Major networks featured the exchange, introducing many viewers to both the specific legislation and broader questions about market transparency. "In 15 years covering Congress," admitted a network financial correspondent, "I've rarely seen anything comparable. What began as criticism of proposed regulations transformed into a compelling case study of why those very regulations might be necessary." Investigations quickly expanded beyond the hearing itself. Financial journalists discovered that 2 of the studies Bessent had cited had not undergone standard peer review despite being presented as academic research, and that the third had included a methodology section that excluded certain market events as anomalous, without clear justification. "When we see coordinated research like this," advised a former Journal of Finance editor, "it's essential to examine not just funding sources, but also methodological choices that might bias results toward predetermined conclusions." 1 week after the hearing, the House Financial Services Committee announced updated witness disclosure requirements. In a rare bipartisan statement, committee leaders declared, "To ensure members receive complete and transparent information, all future witnesses must disclose financial interests, industry affiliations, and coordination with affected entities related to legislation under consideration." For Scott Bessent, the fallout extended beyond Washington. Several institutional investors requested clarification about Key Square's disclosure practices, and financial journalists began examining the firm's previous regulatory filings for patterns similar to those Crockett had highlighted. Regardless of whether any rules were technically violated, wrote Behrens in an analysis piece, the appearance of information advantage undermines the market confidence that sophisticated investors depend upon. The industry should view this as an opportunity to proactively improve transparency rather than resisting reforms. 2 weeks later, Bessent published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. While I maintain that Congresswoman Crockett's legislation would benefit from modifications to preserve market efficiency, I acknowledge the legitimate concerns about transparency and disclosure her proposal addresses. The financial industry must engage constructively with these issues rather than appearing to defend practices that undermine public confidence. His conciliatory tone represented a significant shift from his hearing testimony and suggested the broader impact of Crockett's effective counter-argument. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett leveraged her heightened recognition to build broader support for her legislation. In a widely viewed financial news interview, she emphasized the bill's balanced approach rather than focusing on the confrontation with Bessent. This legislation represents a carefully calibrated approach to transparency, she explained, developed through consultation with former regulators, market participants, and academic experts. It maintains the innovation that makes American markets dynamic while addressing specific practices that create both real and perceived unfairness. Her approach proved effective. 3 weeks later, her bill passed committee with 2 Republican votes. Representatives from districts with significant retail investor populations who were impressed by the legislation's focus on market integrity rather than punitive measures. This bill demonstrates careful attention to maintaining market function while addressing legitimate transparency concerns, explained one Republican supporter. While I don't agree with every provision, Representative Crockett's willingness to focus on systemic integrity rather than villainizing the entire industry shows the kind of balanced approach financial regulation requires. Political analysts noted the irony. The confrontation intended to discredit Crockett's legislation had instead enhanced its prospects by highlighting the very transparency issues it sought to address. This represents a textbook case of political backfire, explained a Georgetown University financial regulation expert. The attack completely failed, strengthening its target while damaging its originators. It demonstrates how substantive preparation can trump even the most prestigious opposition. 6 months later, a major financial publication investigation revealed that the coordination meeting Crockett had referenced was part of a broader industry initiative targeting multiple financial reform proposals. Internal documents showed that participants had specifically identified Crockett as vulnerable to technical criticism due to her relative newness on the committee, an assessment that proved dramatically incorrect. 1 year later, a modified version of the Financial Accountability and Systemic Stability Act passed with unexpected bipartisan support, including provisions specifically addressing the delayed disclosures and amended filings that Crockett had highlighted, using Bessent's own firm as an example. The financial press widely credited the legislation's success to how effectively Crockett had reframed the debate from abstract regulatory philosophy to concrete market integrity concerns. Campaign finance reports revealed that Crockett's political standing had strengthened considerably, with her receiving significant support from retail investor groups and financial professionals who agreed with her focus on market transparency. The effort to discredit her legislation had instead solidified her position as a leading voice in financial reform. As one veteran financial journalist summarized, in Washington financial circles, conventional wisdom held that Wall Street experts could easily outmaneuver legislators on technical market matters. Scott Bessent and his allies learned otherwise. They aimed at Jasmine Crockett and missed completely, handing her both a political victory and a powerful case study that may reshape financial disclosure rules for years to come. For those following this remarkable confrontation, the message became clear. In financial regulation, thorough preparation and specific examples trump even the most prestigious credentials, especially when wielded by someone focused on systemic integrity rather than scoring political points. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more in-depth political and financial analysis that mainstream media won't show you. Click the notification bell to stay informed about every development in this continuing story.